Now, as South Africa experiences tremors and extreme rainfall, is the government equipped to respond to the natural disasters? And to what extent is government, particularly municipalities, legally bound to mitigate the damage caused? To talk to us about this, joined now by Sabelo Gwala, Director of Operations at SALGA in KwaZulu-Natal, as well as Professor Francois Engelbrecht of Wits University's Global Change Institute. Gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for your time tonight here on In Focus. While South Africa is, of course, subject to a wide variety of natural and human-induced hazards, there are three in particular that we are continuing to see, and that is floods, drought, and fire. Sabelo, let me begin with you. What instruments do we have in government, having, of course, formed these three spheres, national, provincial, and local government in particular? What instruments are we talking about here that help us to reduce risk of disaster?
Well, the Disaster Management Act is our frontline piece of legislation. And this act regulates all spheres of government. You would know from the Constitution that disaster management is a function that is concurrent between the national and provincial government. But this act creates an enabling environment for municipalities to also mitigate risks as well as respond to disasters. Now, there is a difference when an act creates an enabling environment and when an act creates an obligation. And this distinction needs to be well understood, because where there is an enabling environment, it means the funding has to come from a ratepayer. In this case, ratepayers have to put out funding for risk reduction and so forth, but they are then also enabled to respond to disasters. And if we are not careful, this can easily be an unfunded mandate where the ratepayer says, well, I'm looking at all my other obligations around basic services and all the other Schedule 4B and 5B of the Constitution. I'm only going to do my functions in the main, and the rest I will have to be funded for. So the Act then creates such an enabling environment should the ratepayer be in a position to put more money towards risk disaster response.
Disaster risk reduction, as you put it, is the focal point, is it not, of the Disaster Management Act? It's put in this way: it is a continuous and integrated, multi-sectoral, multidiscipline process of planning and implementation of measures to reduce risk. There's a sense that we are somewhat caught off guard, right, whenever there are floods, and the Weather Service quickly sends a report, and we find ourselves in a situation where we have to quickly warn people not to drive on that road and so on and so forth. But there is no sense that we are working towards putting preventative measures in place to reduce the risk of disaster.
Well, that isn't necessarily true, and the nature that disasters work is that they are a situation for which you cannot respond to. So for the ample periods of time when municipalities do respond, a disaster is not even declared. And the very essence of a disaster is that the system is unable to respond in that sense. Now, in this case of South Africa, we are in a unique position in the sense that there are climate change issues that are beginning to bear out, which we are seeing, but also municipalities are expanding human settlements faster than we are providing for stormwater facilities, water catchment facilities, making sure people don't settle below flood lines, and so forth. These development or developing country challenges put municipalities in quite a unique and difficult position.
Yeah. Prof, we've already now established that we do have legislation that relates to disaster risk reduction in the country. But the question is this legislation responding adequately enough to mitigate the severe consequences of disasters?
Well, Tabu, I'm a climatologist, and I can speak mostly about one aspect of what Sabelo has just mentioned, which is the early warning component of disaster management. And there I can just point out that we have excellent tools available in South Africa to help us prepare for seasons of above normal rainfall and flooding. For example, already back in September last year, the Weather Service in South Africa detected the development of a La Nina event in the Pacific Ocean. So the Pacific Ocean was starting to become cool. And already in September and in October, they issued the first seasonal forecasts stating very clearly that the upcoming summer season is very likely going to be a season of above normal rainfall. And at the same time, they stated that during such La Nina seasons, there's a high risk of flooding, a higher risk than normal in South Africa. Now that can include large-scale flooding as well as these disastrous flash floods we've been seeing over the last month or so. So early warning systems in South Africa are quite well developed. We then also have the short-range weather forecast. Now that's accurate a day or two into the future. That can really help us to tell us the severe falls of rain will be at this location on that day. That's really reliable 1 to 2 days, maybe 3 days ahead of time. So it's not with the science or the forecasting where things are going wrong. Early warnings are generally reliable. I think awareness is also really good. There are really excellent links between disaster management reduction in South Africa and, for example, the Weather Service. It's more about the uptake of the forecasts. Are we always capacitated to respond to the forecast? So some communities just live in such vulnerable places. For example, along steep slopes where mudslides may occur. Just think about that big disaster. Yeah. April 1919, KwaZulu-Natal. Or communities that live in low-lying areas below the floodline or close to the floodline. They are always vulnerable and they will always be vulnerable for as long as they live in these low-lying areas. So we can, I think, reduce the vulnerability of many of our communities by helping them to not live in those extremely vulnerable areas. Yeah. And then, of course, flood management is another big issue. Not my field of specialty, but let me point out, it becomes very difficult if all the dams in eastern South Africa are at 100% capacity or are overflowing. It's very difficult to manage the water because you can only transport it from one dam to the next, and then you make the problem worse elsewhere. So this is really in a season of exceptionally high rainfall, and it's a real challenge to manage the rainfall.
We'll continue in a moment. We'll get reaction from COGTA on that particular issue, flood risk management, but also on community involvement in disaster risk reduction. Do they manage to get this buy-in from the community? SALGA Director of Operations in KwaZulu-Natal, Sabelo Gwala, will give us their views there on that one when we continue next statements. You're live with us here on In Focus on Newzroom Afrika, Channel 405. SALGA Director of Operations in KwaZulu-Natal, Sabelo Gwala, with us, as well as Professor Francois Engelbrecht of the Wits University's Global Change Institute. The disaster risk management is what we're talking about, of course, as the country continues to experience a severe rainfall. So two issues there, Sabelo, that are being raised here. The one is the ability to get buy-in from community to be a part of a disaster risk reduction. Communities, for example, that live on the flood lines. It becomes almost impossible to convince them to move there, or even if you do move them as government, other families come in and they build there. Is there not a sustainable plan as to how you close off those areas to be able to ensure that no one builds there, but also more concessions of, I don't know, dams that need to be built so that we can be able to deal with the excess water.
Yeah, we do live in a country where community buy-in is probably often the missing link. But if you were to consider in totality across the country, you see both good examples and bad examples. Let's look, for example, the role that the traditional leaders have played in the past, in the recent past, certainly has been to enable that conversation to start to happen, and also indigenous knowledge around some of the patterns that they would also observe. Those types of exchanges are beginning to happen, and it's yielding the results that we want to see. So traditional authorities are coming on board. We also had a big enabler in the sense of SPLUMA legislation, which is land use management legislation, which allowed for local government to plan across the board and create what can be called wall-to-wall land use schemes. And this has allowed for municipalities to plan across the country in terms of land use management. And this piece of legislation was a big breakthrough, and its results are a better coordinated approach, as well as working together with disaster management centers across districts. We are able to now know some of the information that Prof was talking about is able to filter through via the disaster management centers that are district-based, and we are able to have that information in a manner that people can understand. Where we probably are still facing huge challenges is that even when you have identified a particular challenge, the onus is still on the municipality to provide a response, meaning to move those people. Now you've got law enforcement challenges, you've got legal challenges around evictions, you've got other challenges that you need to cater for. And recently the courts seem to suggest that when you move people, the onus is on you to provide alternative accommodation. So when people settle in areas where they shouldn't settle, when you evict them from that place as a municipality, and you should, but the onus is then on you to provide what is called alternative accommodation, and yet human settlement function rests with provincial government. So you can imagine a small rural municipality or a small municipality with a small town moving people without much revenue. If it settles them elsewhere, it has to provide sanitation, water, and all these things for that particular community that it has moved. Something completely unaffordable. So the courts seem to have moved the responsibility towards municipalities without necessarily considering that municipalities are not all the same. So community buy-in without resources for that buy-in to translate to actions is a big challenge. It's probably, I mean, the information can be there, but if the inability to respond, if there's inability to respond, we can't move.
So from what I'm getting a sense that probably national legislation, but also municipal planning has not been entirely explored here. For example, I mean, I know there are institutions such as the Forum on Disaster Management that's supposed to meet. There are institutions like the National Disaster Management Advisory Forum or the Intergovernmental Committee on Disaster Management. How often do those structures meet, and how often do they bring in local government into those conversations so that there is an ongoing monitoring of the plans that are in place?
You know, I would love to point the blame at provincial or national government, but in this case, look at the funding that has gone towards disaster management centers and district level, and you will see that provincial and national government has invested a lot to allow municipalities to be able to plan. And yes, these forums sit from a national to provincial to district level. And with the recent amendments to the Disaster Management Act, even local municipalities are enabled to create these structures. Now, the risk reduction or risk assessment process that each municipality is supposed to do, that's something that came in quite recently. But also, SALGA, less than 10 years ago, was able to succeed in getting a disaster management grant to be in place at Treasury, where municipalities can apply for funding and be able to respond to disasters. So the developments in the past 10 years certainly have been quite pleasing. Where we still face challenges is where it stops being a disaster and starts to be a human settlement issue, and that is where you're not simply looking at my ability to respond to this particular disaster should it occur, but you're looking at the overall infrastructure for responding to South Africa's socio-economic challenges, which are at play and yield risks. And these risks go beyond flooding. They go into many, many other spheres of government, many other sectors of human existence. And this needs us to all have a sustained resourcing plan. And look at how we have been funding the disaster response allocation, 300 million a year, 400 million a year, which isn't sufficient for funding disasters. But remember, that 300 million at Treasury only funds disaster response, not disaster risk reduction.
Yes, indeed.
And there's a huge difference. So a municipality in nesting between Pietermaritzburg and eThekwini, not having a large economic hub, for it to reduce risks, it needs to spend a lot of money. Yes, it can apply for risk response. It can apply to national government when it declares a disaster. But what happens during the year? What's happening now? Probably very little, other than to analyze the information and inform people to respond in that particular moment.
Professor, talk about that. We seem to have capacity to detect. Is there enough being put in the legislative framework that allows for a free flow of communication between those who are able to detect these disasters and those who are supposed to respond in order for them? Because from what I gather, we don't have a readily available response. No. We've got a response team, but we don't have a readily available team that is continually looking at risk reduction. So we are only at a point where we just cope with it when it has occurred.
Well, that's a really important point Sabelo has just made. I would like to point out that what he has just said about investing in terms of reducing vulnerability, making us more resilient where we live in our communities in South Africa, that is going to become more important into the future, because unfortunately, as a consequence of climate change, these extreme rainfall events are occurring more frequently in South Africa than, say, 10 or 20 years ago. So there's a clear trend across the eastern part of South Africa and the summer rainfall region. These types of rainfall events are occurring more frequently. So one positive thing we can do is to also learn from what has happened during this excessive rainfall season brought about by the La Nina event. Because unfortunately, these types of seasons will just occur more frequently and bring more frequently these intense rainfall events across the region. Let me mention the extreme example of Beira in Mozambique, March 2019. More than 1,000 people died. when Tropical Cyclone Idai moved into Mozambique and eventually into Zimbabwe. There wasn't infrastructure to protect Beira from the storm. The 3 days ahead of landfall of the cyclone, we knew that the cyclone was going to make landfall at Beira. But there was no infrastructure to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people out of Beira in time. There's no seawall that protected the people in the informal settlements close to the harbor against the storm surge when it came in from the ocean. So reducing vulnerability, getting the funding for that, that's critical. That we also refer to that as climate change adaptation in the context of these events becoming worse than in the past.
Yeah.
And the other aspect we've already touched upon, there must be